I've been a small-town cop for 13 years. One case still freaks me out. You might remember me from a story I posted here about a year ago, concerning the strange and frightening circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the old Garrity woman back in 2014. Yeah, it's me, a small-town Minnesota cop. I told you in my last post that the Garrity case was the scariest thing that had ever happened to me, and apart from that, nothing much out of the ordinary had ever happened to me in the course of the mostly uneventful and rather dull career of enforcing the law in a rural, middle-of-nowhere hick town most people have probably never even heard of. Well, until about a week ago, that was mostly true. Mostly. But in light of recent circumstances, I feel I have a new story I have to share with you. But first, I have to back up a little bit and tell you about something that happened about 3 years ago. It was a strange thing, but at the time I wrote the first story, it had hardly seemed important enough to warrant mentioning. Cops get used to dealing with all kind of weirdos, people reporting, confessing to false crimes, that sort of thing. Usually it's a pissed-off wife trying to get her husband in trouble with a bogus domestic abuse claim, and then the rest of them are cranks seeking attention. People confessing to murders they didn't commit, etc. I'm sure police departments in the big cities have to put up with crap like this all the time, but even in small-town departments like this, we get it once in a while. It was, I believe, late June or early July 19. I was on night patrol for the first time. I usually work the day, but I was filling in for Vance because he was out of town getting his appendix removed. Joe, a rookie we took in the year before, was doing the day patrol with my partner. Jerry and I was an earlier summer evening. I was in the office shooting the breeze with the chief and Pete, and we were getting ready to punch in for my shift, when a woman appeared in the police station, surprising us. I say appeared because afterwards, when the three of us discussed what had happened, we were all in agreement that none of us had seen or heard her enter the room. It was as if, for one moment, she wasn't there, and then the next, she was. She was young, maybe late teens, early 20s, slender, and might have been pretty, but you wouldn't have known that looking at her current condition. For one thing, she was soaking wet. I mean absolutely drenched head to foot. Her dripping hair was matted and tangled around her face, and her dress, when I noticed, looked kind of old-fashioned. It was saturated. She was panting, completely out of breath, as if she had run a mile, and her eyes were frantic and wide with fear. Another thing I noticed was that she was very pale, unnaturally pale. I mean, her skin looked bone white. I guess we were all pretty taken aback by her appearance for a few seconds. The three of us, me, Pete, and the chief, just gaped at her in shock. "Please," she gasped at us. "You have to help me." The chief, who had been sitting at his desk working on a jigsaw puzzle, it had been a pretty slow night, found his voice. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" he asked, a little awkwardly. "Someone kidnapped me. I managed to get away. I think they were going to kill me." We all exchanged a sober look. Things like this didn't happen very often in our town. "Why don't you have a seat and tell us all about it, ma'am?" the chief asked her politely, and gestured her to an empty chair next to his desk. She sat down, trembling slightly as if she was cold. The chief told Pete to go get her a blanket. There was a supply of them in the basement in the municipal building. There was the police department was located, which also served an emergency shelter in bad weather. Pete went to fetch one. The chief asked the young woman if she'd care for some coffee, gesturing to the pot sitting on the table across the room. "No, thank you," she said distantly, looking past him into the space distracted, or maybe in shock. "What's your name, miss?" the chief asked her. "Shirley," the young woman stammered. "Shirley Ann McDougal." The chief took a police report of the desk drawer and jotted that down. Pete came back to the office carrying a blanket, which he offered to Shirley Ann McDougal. She thanked him and wrapped it around gratefully around her shoulders, but continued to shiver through the interview, and it seemed impossible to warm her body back up. "How are you, Miss McDougal?" the chief asked her. No. "How old are you, Miss McDougal?" the chief asked her. 19. She wrote that down. No, he wrote that down. "Where do you live?" "Right here in town." "How long have you lived here?" "My whole life." At this, the chief frowned a little. He threw a questioning look at Pete, who shrugged, then me. I shook my head. I could see what was bothering the chief. When you've been a cop in a small town for long enough, you get to know most people who lived in the jurisdiction. I've been a cop for 10 years at that point. Pete, who was older than me, had been closer to 20, and the chief, who was older than both of us, had been there nearly 40 years. And yet none of us had ever seen this woman, who claimed to have lived there her whole life, or heard of her before this night. "Where's your address, Miss McDougal?" the chief asked her. "I live with my parents in their apartment, above the hardware store they own, McDougal's Hardware on the main street." That was when I knew there was something really off about this whole deal. There was no McDougal's Hardware on Main Street. In fact, I'd never even heard of the name McDougal ever living in the area. The chief was looking at Shirley strangely, but continued to doing it by the book, and didn't miss a beat. "Now, Miss McDougal—"
"You can call me Shirley,"
she interrupted softly, still staring off vacantly at nothing in particular. "Shirley, why don't you tell us exactly what happened tonight?" So she told us her story, and it only got stranger and stranger.
"I was coming home from the movies. Me and my friends had gone to go see the new Martin and Lewis comedy at the Mayan."
"Whoa," the Pete interrupted her at that point, raising his hand. I'm sorry, you say you went to the Mayan?"
"Yes, to see Martin and Lewis." "Martin and Lewis."
"Martin and who?"
"You know, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. It was with their new film, Partners. It just opened last week."
Pete met my eyes. The look on his face was a combination of confusion and bewilderment. He mouthed the words, "What the fuck is going on?" at me. Shirley went on.
"Anyway, I was walking back home to my parents, and I stopped at Beckman's drugstore to get a chocolate malt first."
Beckman's drugstore. That rang a bell somewhere in the back at my distant corner of my memory. I dug for it, and after a moment I came back. Beckman's had been a pharmacy here in town when I had been a little kid. An independent family-run drugstore, complete with an old-time soda fountain, like something that would have been around back in the 1950s. It had been owned and operated by the Beckmans for 3 generations until the last of them, old Clyde Beckman, had died back in the late 90s. His kids had sold the business, and there was now CVS where it had once stood. I felt a shiver creep up my spine.
"I was going into the store, but a man approached me outside. He was an older man, maybe in his late 40s, silver hair. He was dressed like a priest and had a crutch under one arm. He asked me if I could help him. He said his wallet had fallen under the seat of his car, and he wanted to know if I'd help get it out for him. He was very polite. He seemed harmless, and I felt sorry for him because of the crutch. He led me over to his car."
"What kind of car was it, Shirley?" The chief interrupted her. She thought about it for a few seconds.
"It was a Buick, I think. Yeah, it was a dark Buick, a couple of years old, maybe 1953 or 54.
1953 or 54 Buick that, according to Shirley McDougal, was only a couple years old. What the fuck was this? Was this chick on something? Was she nuts or pulling some kind of stupid prank? I searched her face, trying to detect a lie, but she seemed genuinely shaken up by whatever had happened, whatever she had been through. "Did you get a license plate, Shirley?" the chief asked her.
I just got a glimpse as we were going around it. I didn't see the numbers, but I noticed it was an out-of-state car. I think the license plate said Oklahoma."
"Then what happened, Shirley?" the chief gently prodded.
"I knelt down and was feeling beneath the driver's seat for his wallet, and then—"
She paused and took a long, shaky breath, and exhaled sharply, as if mustering her courage to recall her ordeal to herself.
"Something hit me in the back of the head. It hit me hard. It was him. The man dressed like a priest. He hit me from behind. I think it was with his crutch he was carrying. He hit me again, and I was stunned, dazed. I think I might have lost consciousness for a few moments, and then when I came to, he was dragging me around to the back of his car. I tried to fight him off, but he slapped me in the face and told me to shut up or he'd kill me. He called me a—"
She hesitated.
"I'd rather not repeat what he said. He lifted the lid of his trunk and shoved me inside, and then slammed it shut. I was screaming at the top of my lungs and pounding against the truck, but he'd already gotten back in his car and started. Then, when he was driving, I was screaming and crying, praying, begging for him not to hurt me. I told him I wanted to see my parents again. He just kept driving. I don't know how long he drove. A long time, maybe an hour. But then something happened. He had an accident. I heard him shout an alarm, and the car swerved sharply. I could hear the tires shriek. We went off the road, and then the next thing I knew, the trunk was filling with cold water. We must have crashed into the lake or a pond. I was panicking, pounding, trying to force the trunk open, and then I don't remember. It all just went black for a while. Next thing I remember is splashing around at the surface of the water. I don't know how I managed to get out. I swam to the shore and climbed back on the road and started walking back into town.
Her story finished. Shirley fell silent. She lowered her head, shuddering. None of us knew what to say. We stood there trying to make sense of what she had told us. I looked at Pete and at the chief. The chief looked back at me, a disturbed expression on his face.
"May I use the telephone?"
Shirley asked, looking up.
I want to call my parents and tell them I'm alright.
Of course, Shirley. Just give us one moment. We want to run this guy's description out on the radio. Get an ASP and APB going on to catch this creep. The chief told her in a slightly patronizing manner as he stood up, gesturing to me and Pete to follow him. He led us out of the office and shut the door. What the fuck was she talking about, Chief? Pete asked him in a Soto voice.
The Mayan Theater went out of business when I was a kid, 30 years ago. There's a liquor store there now.
Yes, and McDougal's hardware is long gone too, the chief replied. Long before your time, either of you. It burned down when I was a kid, back in 67. I think I was maybe 68, and then the McDougal's went up in flames with it. They died in their sleep. Pete and me took a moment to absorb that.
So what the fuck's her deal? Is she going crazy? Is she strung out or what?
The chief shrugged. Who knows? Maybe something really did happen to her tonight and the trauma has caused some kind of psychotic episode. Dissociative identity disorder, whatever they call it. He opened the office door and motioned us back in. Shirley McDougal, or whatever her name really was still sitting beside the chief's desk. She looked up and when we re-entered,
"Can I call my parents now?"
she asked us urgently as the chief sat back down.
"They must be worried sick about me."
Shirley, the chief started staring at her. Shirley, the chief said. Fuck. Shirley, the chief said, staring at her thoroughly. Who's the current U.S. president?
She blinked at him. "What? Dwight Eisenhower. What does that have to do with anything?"
The chief looked at her for what seemed like a long time. Shirley, he asked her again softly, do you know what year it is?
She gave a puzzled look. "Excuse me?"
Do you know what year it is?
1956. Why do you ask?
No, Shirley, he said gently, looking at her with compassion. It's not 1956. It's 2019. 1956 was 63 years ago.
She looked at him, confused. 2019? What are you talking about? Are you crazy?
Look at the calendar behind me, Shirley, he told her, pointing at the bulletin board with the wall above him. Looking at him suspiciously, Shirley stood up and approached the calendar. She stood directly in front of it, staring for some time and then backed away, her eyes widening in disbelief.
"No, this is some sort of trick. It has to be,"
she stammered, terrified and confused. Shirley, the chief said, pointing to the computer on his desk. Have you ever seen one of these before? But Shirley ignored him. Her attention had shifted to a large map of the United States on the opposite wall. She stepped up to it, studying it intensely.
"Hawaii and Alaska?" she muttered quietly to herself.
She moved to the window and looked outside the parking lot.
"The cars,"
she said, her voice rising in panic.
"What's wrong with the cars? Why do they look so different?"
We stood by the chief's desk, just watching her, dumbfounded and not knowing how to react. Shirley turned to face us, beginning to shudder. She fell to her knees, clutching her midsection, her breath heaving in and out as she was hyperventilating.
"I think I'm going to be sick,"
she uttered in a low, choked voice.
"Please, Show me where the ladies' room is. I think I'm going to be sick.
Pete looked at the chief, who nodded, grim-faced. Pete helped Shirley to her feet and escorted her out of the office. She looked back at him. The chief mouthed at him, "Keep an eye on her." Pete nodded and then stepped through the door and out of sight. A long, awkward moment of silence passed, with the chief sitting at his desk, distractingly toying with a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and me standing there, both of us trying to wrap our heads around what just happened. The entire encounter, from the moment the soaking wet woman had entered the police station to when Pete had taken her to the restroom, had lasted no more than 20 minutes. I finally broke the silence, forcing out a nervous laugh and trying to lighten the mood. "A weird night, huh?" I said to the chief. He had grunted in response, seeming preoccupied with something. "So, who should we call? The state cops or the hospital?" I asked. He didn't answer me. He was still lost in thought, staring intently straight ahead. "What's on your mind, Chief?" "Something just dawned on me. A couple minutes ago, just when Pete and her were leaving." He looked at me troubled. 1956 was 2 years before I was born, but McDougal's Hardware store was still in town when I was 9. My parents used to do business with the McDougals. I remember something when I was a kid. Hearing my parents talk, something about the McDougals having a daughter that vanished under mysterious circumstances. I looked at him. "Come on, Chief, you're not telling me you're actually buying into this thing, are you?" It wouldn't be the first time. Something strange has happened in this town," he said, giving me a pointed look. "I think you know what I'm talking about." I didn't answer him, but I did know what he was talking about. In my mind, I saw images I cared not to remember. A blood-splattered motel room. Sheets torn from the bed, bloody claw marks on the carpet, trailing and stopping abruptly in an empty closet. I shuddered at the memory. Suddenly, there was a commotion down the hall. Pete was yelling for both of us to come quick. "Shit, what now?" I muttered to myself, and we hurried into the office. Pete was standing down the hall, just outside the women's restroom. He looked rattled. "She's gone," he said as we got closer. "What the hell do you mean, she's gone?" the chief demanded. "See for yourself," Pete answered, and pushed open the restroom door. We looked in, and all 3 stalls were standing open with their doors vacant. The chief turned to Pete. "Well, where the hell'd she go? I thought you were watching her." "Hey, Chief, I was standing right here the whole time, I swear it," he insisted, looking anxious and scared. He muttered something to himself, something I couldn't quite make out. I asked him to repeat it. He looked at me. I had never seen Pete so frightened before in my life. "I said she was cold. When I was helping her go to the restroom, my hand touched her arm. It was so cold. It was like it was touching the skin of a corpse." The chief shot me a grim look when I reciprocated. The chief shot me a grim look which I reciprocated, feeling a stirring fear in the pit of my stomach like when I was there, much like what happened back in 14. The chief and I entered the women's room and looked around. There wasn't much to see and no obvious place to hide. 3 empty stalls and a sink. There was a small window directly above the sink. I approached it, certain I was going to find it locked, but the latch was unfastened. I felt a weird sense of relief at that. That the avenue of denial, this fallback position of logical explanation, hadn't been blocked, because otherwise... "Chief," I said, "window's unlocked." "Outside, quick," he ordered me. Me and Pete hastily followed him in the hallway to the main entrance of the municipal building. The police department was on the ground level, and that's important. We went outside and looked around. All we saw on the front lawn was the municipal building and the main street beyond it. Most desperately, on this early summer evening, the window in the women's restroom faced the left side of the building, which we went in that direction. But when we turned the corner, there was nothing there. No sign of the mysterious young woman who had called herself Shirley McDougal. I looked up. The window was about 10 feet above the ground. While small, it was not impossible for someone with a smaller build like Shirley to have squeezed through. But what I'm getting at is it's inconceivable for her to escape through that window, drop to the ground below, and then disappeared into the night. The grass had been recently mowed, and there hadn't been raining, so the ground hadn't left any footprints we could see to determine which direction she had gone. We looked at the office window for some time. Finally, the chief lowered his head and admitted a slightly shaky chuckle. "She must have closed it behind her before she jumped." "Guess she was nuts, huh, Chief?" Pete said. "Guess so. Or lying, or on drugs, or who the hell knows." But that troubled, disturbing look was still in the Chief's eyes. And then, I think he was trying to rationalize it, what had happened, much like I was. "Let's go back inside," he told me and Pete. And that was just what we did. It was easier for us to believe that she had been dealing with some deeply disturbed young woman, or a flake looking for some attention, because otherwise, what would we have to accept? What, we had been questioning a ghost that summer night? The chief did report the incident to the state police and put out an alert on her, but nothing ever came of it. And then we never saw or heard from Ashley Ann McDougal ever again. I did some research in my free time, just out of curiosity, or so I told myself, searching online and looking through old newspapers and town records. There really had been a young woman named Shirley Ann McDougal, the 19-year-old daughter of Wilbur and Harriet McDougal, the owners of McDougal Hardware. And she really did disappear one night back in the early August of 1956, never to be seen or heard from again. But for all I knew, the crazy woman we had dealt with had heard about the case and incorporated details into her delusion. There were no pictures, if you were wondering. I've looked, but I couldn't find anything in the newspapers. I even tried locating any of Shirley's surviving relatives, but to no avail. It had been over 60 years, and presumably all the family photographs had been destroyed in the fire that killed her parents. I forced it all out of my mind, and I was a police officer. I forced it all out of my mind. I was a police officer, and there were more pressing matters to deal with. Eventually, I forgot about the strange encounter with Shirley McDougal. Then, last week, I went to the station to start my usual shift. The chief beckoned me to his office. His face was pale and grave. And he didn't say anything, just pointed to the newspaper on his desk. I picked it up and looked at the headline. "Lake yields dark secret after 66 years. The temperature of the chief's office seemed to drop 10 degrees as I read the story. One town over, some guy in a boat had been trying out his new fish locating sonar, and had inadvertently stumbled upon a car at the bottom of a lake, 20 feet down. He went to the police station, and they had hoisted the car from the surface, an old, battered, rusted wreck that had once been a 1953 Buick. A set of skeletal remains belonging to a man had been found in the driver's seat. The old Buick had an Oklahoma license plate, and the authorities had ran it through the system and discovered the vehicle was a match for a car registered to a man the FBI had been looking for back in the late 1950s, a drifter and a convicted offender they suspected of being a serial killer, or a spree killer as they called him back then, who was believed to have abducted and murdered up to 10 young women in 6 different states. The last intended victim had managed to escape. She claimed the man had dressed as a priest and had tried to lure her into his car, then overpower her. This had happened in Iowa, 1 state away from Minnesota. After that, he just vanished from the FBI's radar. When they conducted a more detailed inspection of the wrecked Buick, they made a further gruesome discovery. A second skeleton was found in the trunk. A skeleton belonging to a young woman.